Greek philosophy, I'm going to try to make this one shorter. I know we're getting into it a bit with the Greeks. This big picture overview, pre-Socratics, all over the place. Everybody mentioned here has a pretty good idea, and they will show up oftentimes much later, sometimes much more closer to recent times. So, for example, the atom, right, was first thought of by a Greek, but it didn't seem like that was the case until modern physicists. So not that long ago in the past, sort of recreated the idea, as it were, and chemists and so on. The sophists, sophistry. People use that as a pejorative or a bad term, right? You're just using sophistry. This is just language, right? Lawyers and do think lawyerly, because what people would do, like the rich people that I was talking about before, if they got hauled into court, oftentimes because they were suing each other, which was a thing back then they had to pay. They had to go defend themselves, but they would need to know how to make an argument, how to make a speech, and that's what these people would train them, right? And so they weren't really philosophers in the sense that we talk about philosophers today until Socrates. Right, so what is the good life? What is virtue? All of that sort of stuff. Socrates didn't write anything down. Plato wrote a lot of this stuff down. It seems like the first part of Plato, he's writing down a lot of what Socrates said. But then later on in his writings, he starts writing down more of what he actually thought. Right? It's not all that different, but it is different. Okay, so what we want to talk about, the longest reach, as it were, this is not all Plato says. But in terms of what we're going to talk about in this course, the theory of forms, right? The good, right? So Plato thought, and if this seems odd to you, or maybe it doesn't, he thought true reality was not in this world. All right, true reality, a form worth of the essence of things, are not they're not here in what we call the earth. They are otherworldly, right? So like things like circles and spheres and all that have existed, will always exist somewhere else that is not here. We have spheres, we have balls in this, on this, what we would say today our planet, right? But that's not where a real ball is. Right? So a real ball is in some other, because it can't perfectly manifest. So this whole world is an imperfect manifestation. Right? So he tries to explain this a few different ways, the most famous being the allegory of the cave. And so if you could see this world of forms, right, you're seeing directly into truth. That would be the equivalent for him of if we had what you really are, what all of us really are, we're seeing shadows on the wall of the form. So we think that we're seeing, virtue or this or that or the other thing. Most of the things we even see in normal life they're coming from this otherworldly thing that is the source of like the fire, but it's imperfectly manifested, and that's not the truth. If you were to see the truth, the fire, if you were to somebody cuts you from the chain, or you're able to get loose, you would go out and see the sun outside, and that's the actual form. And then you would come back, and everybody would think you were crazy, right? Because they know what reality, they've been looking at it their whole lives, but they don't really realize that they're just seeing the shadows on the wall for the fire. Okay, so this seems like, well, how would this apply to me, Davis? All right, well, because we kind of do that sometimes. So where do we go in Western civilization? What is everybody wants to go to heaven, right? Whereas heaven, not here, right? Other world, that's where things are perfect, right? So it's not like the ancient Egyptians didn't have a big sort of thing with the afterlife, the otherworldly stuff and all that. But here it's starting, Plato's putting a lot of language around this idea that is going to last and last and last in Western civilization, and oftentimes gets smashed together with other systems as a Greek culture. Remember, through Hellenism, especially after Alexander the Great goes into and conquers other sections of the world. And remember, the engineers are going to come in and build and all that, and theaters and roads and irrigation systems and central sources of water for people to go to. Well, this is one of the other things that they are bringing, because people are going to come in and go, well, Plato thought this back in the day. But this other guy that we had, and it's not just these two, these are just the two real big ones, right? Aristotle didn't think this. And I'm skipping over, by the way, a lot of stuff that would be great for a presentation. So if you wanted to do, like, Confucius is hugely important in China. One of, if not the most important thing in world history in terms of influence, right? Confucius. But we only have so much time to cover all of this. So Aristotle followed, not the opposite. Aristotle, he thought a different idea of forms. Okay, so Aristotle is not saying that forms do not exist. What he is saying is that we can come to, he thinks forms are trying to get into this world, that are manifesting in this world through teleology. All right. And so what he thought was, so if you see a couple of trees, a couple of cats, right? Or more, a whole grove of trees, right? That you could study. If you were looking at about the same kind of tree, you can see what's common in these. And so what's common must be the forms, right? So we can learn things about the forms, but the forms aren't necessarily completely otherworldly. We know this because we can say all sorts of stuff about them. And so he starts and think about this as a way to think more so than anything else, called the empirical method, right? A method of inquiry dependent upon direct experience, and so that he can write down and then other people can try out, right, down there. So if you don't believe, or you can read what people have tried out in the past, right, and improve on it, right? So we could measure in a way like what forms are doing over time. Maybe we did something wrong in the past. We can talk about the method. This is even basic classification, right? About what kind of different trees there are, or critters or whatever. This is this basic, what today we would call basic science. He didn't call it basic science. In his mind, he thought he was studying forms, right? So these Plato and Aristotle are going to end up having their adherents, more or less, over the next few thousand years, right, up to today, essentially, right? And so people are going to say, well, your head's more in the clouds, you're a lot more like Plato, or you seem grounded in the earth, and then, like, you seem to have practical ideas and so on, so you're a lot more like Aristotle, right? So we're going to talk about Plato, and we're going to talk about both of these at times throughout the course. But Plato, not too far from now, when we talk about a really important theological thinker, Augustine of Hippo, right? Because what he's going to say down there, he's going to be heavily influenced by a religion called Manichaeism, but the thought of Plato as well. So we're going to go back to this idea now, because he's going to use it, and he's going to help Christians in the Middle Ages, which is long, long after he dies. So over roughly the 1200 years after he dies, until really probably his peak is in the high of influence anyways, in the high Middle Ages, so 1200 or so AD. And what Augustine of Hippo is going to do is essentially put his stamp on all of this. And this is important because, like, how we understand the Bible, Christian thought, all that sort of stuff really is going back to Plato through Augustine of Hippo, and then some other major thinkers along the way. But this is, you can start to see the pattern coming into place, and where some of this stuff, also Paul, by the way, from the Bible, right? You would think that he was divorced from all this, but it's not. Right, because remember, Paul is a Roman citizen, right? And so, as a Roman citizen, he's going to, in part, besides all the Jewish training that he got, he's going to know about Greek philosophers like Plato and Aristotle. All right, and so this sort of vein of thought will show up in the letters, right, of Paul. Okay, and I think so. There's a whole bunch of stuff here I did not talk about, but I think I got the gist of what's going to be really important for us in the future, especially when we get to sort of the Middle Ages and how when Christianity really gets rolling around the time of Constantine later on too.